She inherited a shabby beach house. What was hidden in the basement left her stunned. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m., jolting Raya Morgan from the kind of restless sleep that had become her default over the past 6 months. She fumbled for her cell phone, squinting at the unfamiliar number glowing on the screen. "Ms. Morgan?" The voice belonged to an elderly man with a thick southern drawl. "This is Harold Whitfield, attorney for the estate of Lawrence Beaumont. I'm afraid I have some news about your great-uncle." Raya sat up in her cramped studio apartment, pushing aside the stack of rejection letters from marine research facilities that had somehow migrated to her nightstand. Great-uncle Lawrence. She hadn't thought about him in years. The mysterious family member who sent birthday cards with crisp $20 bills but never attended family gatherings. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Beaumont passed away last Tuesday," the lawyer continued. "Heart attack, very sudden. But the reason I'm calling, Ms. Morgan, is that you've been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate." The words seemed to float in the darkness of her apartment. Raya, who had been surviving on ramen noodles and the occasional freelance marine consulting gig, suddenly found herself inheriting property from a man she'd met maybe 3 times in her 28 years of life. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, she remembered those birthday cards, always signed with the same careful script. "For my brilliant great-niece, who will change the world's oceans. Uncle Lawrence." 2 weeks later, Raya stood before the most decrepit beach house she'd ever seen, holding a set of old brass keys that felt heavier than they should. The October wind whipped across the North Carolina coastline, carrying the sharp scent of salt and something else, something that reminded her of old books and forgotten stories. The house squatted on weathered stilts about 50 yards from the high tide line, its gray shingles curled and missing in patches like scales on a dying fish. Paint peeled from the window frames in long strips, and the front porch sagged at an angle that defied basic engineering principles. If she hadn't known better, Raya would have assumed the place had been abandoned for decades. "Well, Uncle Lawrence," she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter against the October chill. "This is quite the inheritance." She'd driven down from Raleigh in her aging Honda, taking time off from her job at the downtown aquarium, the only marine biology position she'd been able to find after graduating with her master's degree. The work was fine, educational programs for school children and cleaning tank filters, but it wasn't the ocean research she dreamed of. It wasn't the groundbreaking work that would justify the student loans that kept her awake at night. The realtor she'd spoken with over the phone had been blunt. "Honey, that old place isn't worth the land it's sitting on. Hurricane season's been rough on that stretch of coast, and the foundation's probably compromised. You'd be smart to take whatever cash offer comes along and run." But now, standing here with the endless Atlantic stretching toward the horizon, Raya felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. The house might be falling apart, but the location was breathtaking. This was the kind of untouched coastline that marine biologists dreamed of. No resort developments, no crowds, just pure, wild ocean. She climbed the rickety stairs to the front door, testing each step before trusting it with her full weight. The brass key turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been waiting for her. The interior was a time capsule. Nautical charts covered nearly every wall, their edges yellowed and curling. Shelves lined with maritime books created narrow pathways through rooms filled with diving equipment, fishing nets, and glass floats in various shades of blue and green. The air smelled of brine and old paper, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of years by the ocean. But it was the living room that stopped her in her tracks. Above a stone fireplace that dominated the far wall hung a massive diver's helmet, its copper surface green with age. The thing must have weighed 50 pounds, suspended by thick chains that looked original to the house. Raya moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. The helmet was clearly vintage, probably from the 1950s or earlier, with thick glass viewing ports and heavy brass fittings. But what made her breath catch were the initials painted on the front in faded white letters. Amar. She stood there for a long moment, studying those letters. Amar. Not Abby for Lawrence Beaumont. Someone else had owned this helmet first, someone whose story was apparently important enough for her great-uncle to mount it in the place of honor above his fireplace. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the cluttered room, Raya found herself making a decision that surprised her. She wasn't going to sell the house. Not yet. There were too many questions here, too many pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to see. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the aquarium, asking when she'd be back from her family emergency. Raya looked around the strange, wonderful mess of her inheritance and typed back, "Might need a few more days." Outside, the waves crashed against the shore with a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. For the first time in months, Raya Morgan felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The diver's helmet watched over it all, keeping its secrets for now. 3 days into her stay at the beach house, Raya had managed to clear enough space in the living room to set up a makeshift bedroom on the old leather couch. She'd found working electricity, miraculously, and a temperamental water heater that produced lukewarm showers if she sweet-talked it just right. But the basement remained a mystery, accessible only through a narrow door she'd discovered hidden behind a wall of stacked fishing nets. The wooden stairs creaked ominously as she descended, flashlight in hand. Her phone had no signal this far from town, and the basement's single bare bulb had burned out decades ago, leaving her dependent on the weak beam cutting through the musty darkness. The basement was a hoarder's paradise of maritime artifacts. Wooden crates lined the walls, each filled with diving equipment, rope, and tools she couldn't identify. Mason jars filled with what looked like sand samples occupied an entire shelf, each labeled with dates and cryptic location codes. The concrete floor was slick with moisture from the nearby ocean, and everything smelled of salt and rust. Raya had been down here twice before, but today she was determined to make sense of the chaos. She needed to know what she'd inherited, what was valuable, and what was just junk. The insurance adjuster was coming next week, and she couldn't very well tell him the basement contained a bunch of old sea stuff. She started with the crates closest to the stairs, photographing contents on her phone before carefully cataloging each item. Most of it seemed to be standard diving gear, weight belts, regulators, masks in various states of decay. But some pieces looked expensive, professional-grade equipment that would have cost thousands of dollars new. "What were you doing down here, Uncle Lawrence?" she whispered, lifting a dive computer that looked barely used despite being at least 20 years old. As she worked deeper into the basement, Raya noticed the floor felt different beneath her feet. The concrete near the walls was solid, but toward the center of the room, wooden planks had been laid over what felt like loose soil. She knelt down, running her fingers along the boards. They weren't original to the house. These planks were newer, maybe 15 years old, and they weren't properly secured. In fact, they seemed to be covering something deliberately. Raya stood up and took a step back to get a better look at the floor pattern. That's when it happened. The board beneath her left foot gave way with a splintering crack, and her leg plunged through up to the knee. She yelped in surprise, windmilling her arms to keep from falling completely into whatever lay beneath the floorboards. "Great. Just great," she muttered, carefully extracting her leg from the hole. Her jeans were torn, and she could feel a scrape along her shin, but nothing seemed broken. She shone her flashlight down through the gap and froze. There was definitely something down there. Working carefully, Raya pried up the broken board and then the two adjacent ones. The wood came up easily, revealing a rectangular pit about 3 feet deep. And sitting at the bottom, wrapped in what looked like waterproof canvas, was a wooden chest. Her heart hammered as she climbed down into the pit. The chest was heavy, requiring all her strength to lift it up to floor level. It was maybe 2 feet long and a foot deep, made of dark wood that had been treated with some kind of preservative. Brass corners and a brass lock completed the look of something that belonged in a pirate movie. The lock was old but functional, and to her amazement, a key hung from a leather cord tied to one of the handles. Raya's hands shook slightly as she turned the key. The lock clicked open with the satisfying sound of well-maintained mechanisms. She lifted the lid and gasped. The chest was lined with felt and divided into small compartments, each containing a carefully wrapped artifact. She lifted the first item, A small canvas pouch that contained 3 coins, each in its own protective sleeve. They looked old, possibly Spanish, with dates she could barely make out. A small tag was attached. Recovered June 12, 1987. GPS 35.2431 minus 75.5294. Depth 23 feet. The next compartment held ceramic shards, individually wrapped and tagged with similar precision. Then jewelry, a tarnished silver ring, a broken chain, what looked like part of a compass. Every single item had been catalogued with the same meticulous care: date recovered, GPS coordinates, depth, sometimes additional notes about weather conditions or tidal patterns. But it was the item in the largest compartment that made her breath catch. A leather-bound journal, its cover dark with age and salt exposure. The title was embossed in faded gold letters. My Rex Mr. Mr. The same initials from the diving helmet upstairs. Raya carefully lifted the journal from its resting place. The leather was soft and supple, clearly well maintained despite its age. As she opened to the first page, her flashlight illuminated careful handwriting in blue ink. Property of Marcus Reed. If found, please return to Lawrence Beaumont, 1247 Tidewater Road, Nags Head, North Carolina. He'll know what to do with it. Marcus Reed. Mr. wasn't Lawrence at all, it was someone else entirely. Someone who had trusted her great-uncle with 40 years' worth of carefully documented salvage work. Raya sank back against the basement wall, journal clutched in her hands, and realized she'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple inheritance. Raya spent the entire night in the basement, poring over Marcus Reed's journal by flashlight. Her phone battery had died hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to leave the chest and its secrets. The concrete floor was cold against her back, but she barely noticed the discomfort as page after page revealed the hidden life of 2 men who had spent decades exploring the ocean floor. The journal spanned 43 years, from 1981 to 2024, just months before Lawrence's death. The early entries were straightforward salvage logs, documenting dives to known shipwrecks along the Outer Banks. Marcus Reed had been thorough in his record-keeping, noting everything from water temperature to equipment malfunctions. But as Raya read deeper, patterns began to emerge that made her scientific mind buzz with curiosity. Every few pages, scattered throughout the chronological entries, were references to something called Project Sandglass. These entries were different from the others, written in a kind of code that used maritime terminology to disguise their true meaning. Sandglass. Check the tide tables for the glass house garden. Still growing beautifully at 35.1847, minus 75.4921. L. Suggests waiting for the full moon before the next harvest. Sandglass. The glass house foundation is more extensive than we thought. New rooms discovered in the east wing. L. Wants to document everything before we proceed. Sandglass. Weather forced us to postpone the glass house inventory again. The basement level remains unexplored. This project requires more time than we initially calculated. The same coordinates appeared in every Sandglass entry, 35.1847, minus 75.4921. Always disguised as something else, a garden, a house, a foundation, but always the same location. Raya grabbed a pen from the floor and began mapping out the Sandglass entries on the back pages of the journal. The dates were sporadic but consistent, with at least one entry every 6 months for over 20 years. The most recent was dated just 3 months ago. Sandglass, L. says it's time to pass the glass house deed to the next generation. The foundation is secure, but the inheritance papers need to be filed properly. Her hands trembled as she read those words. Lawrence had been planning this. Her inheritance wasn't random, it was deliberate, calculated, part of some larger scheme that involved Marcus Reed and whatever lay at those coordinates. As dawn light began filtering through the basement's single window, Raya climbed back upstairs with the journal clutched against her chest. She needed her laptop, her marine charts, and coffee, lots of coffee. The kitchen yielded instant coffee and stale crackers, which she devoured while her laptop booted up. Her first search was for the coordinates, 35.1847 minus 75.4921. The numbers placed the location about 8 miles off the coast, in roughly 60 feet of water. According to every maritime database she could access, the site was empty ocean floor, no recorded wrecks, no hazards to navigation, nothing. But Marcus Reed and Lawrence had been visiting that exact spot for over 2 decades. Raya cross-referenced the coordinates with historical shipping records, tidal charts, and geological surveys. The location sat near the edge of the continental shelf, where the ocean floor dropped away into deeper waters. It was an area known for strong currents and unpredictable weather, not a place casual divers would explore. She pulled up satellite imagery of the area, zooming in until she could see the color variations in the water that indicated depth changes. The site appeared unremarkable, just deep blue water that matched the surrounding ocean. But satellite images only showed the surface. As the morning wore on, Raya found herself falling down research rabbit holes that left her more confused than when she'd started. She searched for Marcus Reed but found nothing, no obituaries, no dive certifications, no public records. It was as if the man had never existed outside the pages of his journal. But Lawrence Beaumont had definitely existed, and the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. Why had her family's reclusive uncle chosen marine salvage as his life's work? How had he afforded all the expensive equipment in the basement? And why had he trusted a stranger's journal with 40 years of carefully documented secrets? By noon, Raya had filled 3 pages with notes, theories, and unanswered questions. The journal lay open beside her laptop, and she found herself staring at the most recent sandglass entry again and again. The foundation is secure, but the inheritance papers need to be filed properly. Lawrence hadn't just left her a house. He'd left her a mystery, a responsibility, and quite possibly a treasure that had been hidden beneath the waves for decades. The question was, what exactly was she supposed to do with it? She closed the laptop and looked up at the diving helmet above the fireplace. Marcus Reed's helmet, watching over Lawrence's house, keeping guard over secrets that now belonged to her. "Okay, Uncle Lawrence," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm listening. But I'm going to need help figuring out what you wanted me to find." The afternoon light streamed through the salt-stained windows, and somewhere out in the Atlantic, Project Sandglass waited. The Nag's Head Marina smelled of diesel fuel and fish guts, a combination that should have been unpleasant but somehow felt like home to Raya after a week at the beach house. She walked down the weathered dock, Marcus Reed's journal tucked securely in her waterproof backpack, looking for slip number 47. She'd spent 2 days researching local dive operators before settling on Ben Cartwright. His online reviews were sparse but glowing. Customers praised his knowledge of local waters and his old-school approach to diving safety. More importantly, when she called and mentioned Lawrence Beaumont's name, there had been a long pause before Ben had agreed to meet her. "You must be Raya," a gravelly voice called from behind her. She turned to see a man in his 60s climbing out of a well-maintained dive boat. Ben Cartwright was shorter than she'd expected, with skin weathered to leather by decades of sun and salt. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of reading ocean conditions and making split-second decisions underwater. "Ben?" She extended her hand, which he shook with a grip that could crack walnuts. "Thank you for agreeing to take me out. I know my request was unusual." "Unusual's one word for it," Ben replied, securing a line to the dock cleat with practiced efficiency. "You want to dive a site that supposedly has nothing on it, and you won't tell me why. Most people, I'd say no and send them on their way. But Lawrence Beaumont was a good man, and if his great-niece thinks there's something worth seeing out there, I figure I owe it to his memory to at least take a look." Ben's expression softened slightly. "Larry and I went way back. Surprised he never mentioned me." Raya felt a flutter of excitement. "Actually, I think he might have. Did you ever know someone named Marcus Reed?" The change in Ben's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His weathered face went pale, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found some of his things at Uncle Lawrence's house." Diving equipment records. She decided not to mention the journal yet. I think they were partners. Ben was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to determine how much she knew. Finally, he nodded toward his boat. We should probably have this conversation out on the water. Some stories aren't meant for marinas. 20 minutes later, they were cutting through moderate swells toward the coordinates Raya had memorized from the journal. Ben's boat was a classic Carolina workboat, built for functionality rather than comfort. The twin engines pushed them steadily southeast, away from the tourist beaches and into the deeper waters where commercial fishermen and serious divers made their living. Marcus Reed was the best wreck diver I ever knew, Ben finally said over the engine noise. Could find things on the bottom that other people missed, could read the ocean like a book. But he was also paranoid as hell about treasure hunters and federal bureaucrats. Treasure hunters? The Outer Banks are littered with wrecks, Raya. 3 centuries of ships that didn't make it past the shoals. Most of them are picked clean or protected by maritime law, but every now and then, someone finds something significant. When that happens, the feds swoop in, academic institutions get involved, and the person who actually made the discovery gets pushed out of the picture. Raya thought about the meticulous records in Marcus's journal, the careful cataloging of every artifact. So Marcus and Lawrence were protecting their discoveries? That would be my guess, Ben said, checking his GPS. We're almost there. You sure about these coordinates? Raya nodded, her heart racing as Ben cut the engines and dropped anchor. The water here was a deep, dark blue that seemed to go on forever. According to her charts, they were in 62 feet of water, well within recreational diving limits but deep enough that visibility would be limited. As they suited up, Ben kept glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You know, he said, adjusting her buoyancy compensator. I went diving with Marcus and Larry a few times over the years. Always wondered what they were so secretive about. The descent was like entering another world. At 30 feet, the sunlight began to fade, and by 50 feet, Raya's flashlight was essential. The ocean floor here was mostly sand and scattered debris, the kind of bottom that should have been unremarkable. But Marcus Reed's coordinates were precise. At 58 feet, Raya's light caught something that made her heart stop. Rising from the sand like the ribs of a massive whale was the wooden skeleton of a ship. The hull was enormous, easily 200 feet long, covered in marine growth that had transformed it into an artificial reef. Fish darted between the broken timbers, and her light revealed cannons scattered around the wreck site. This wasn't just any shipwreck. This was something old, something significant, something that had been deliberately kept secret. Ben appeared beside her, his own light illuminating a section of the hull where barnacles and coral had been recently disturbed. Someone had been working here, carefully excavating specific areas of the wreck. Following Marcus's journal notes, Raya swam toward the stern section. There, tucked beneath a massive beam exactly where the journal had indicated, she found a lead box the size of a shoebox, sealed with wax and wrapped in modern dive rope. Her hands shook as she lifted the box from its hiding place. Even underwater, she could tell it was heavy, substantial. This was what Marcus Reed and Lawrence Beaumont had been protecting. As they surfaced with their discovery, Raya had no idea that she was holding artifacts from La Hermosa Estrella, a Spanish treasure ship that had vanished without a trace in 1736. Back at the marina, Raya's hands trembled as she carefully opened the lead box under Ben's watchful eye. The wax seal cracked away in chunks, releasing the scent of old metal and preserved wood. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived decades underwater, lay treasures that made her breath catch. Gold coins, each one heavy and perfectly preserved, stamped with Spanish seals and dates from the 1730s. A signet ring bearing an elaborate coat of arms. Most stunning of all, a brass nameplate that read, La Hermosa Estrella, in ornate script, with smaller text identifying it as a vessel of the Spanish colonial fleet. Mother of God, Ben whispered, holding one of the coins up to the afternoon light. Raya, do you know what this is? She did. Every marine archaeology student learned about La Hermosa Estrella, The treasure ship that had vanished without a trace in 1736, taking with it a fortune in New World gold and the personal effects of a Spanish leader. It was one of the great unsolved mysteries of colonial maritime history. "We have to report this," Raya said, her scientific training overriding the adventurer's instinct to keep the discovery secret. "This is huge, Ben. This could rewrite what we know about Spanish shipping routes." Ben looked skeptical. "You sure about that? Marcus and Lawrence kept this quiet for 40 years. Maybe they had their reasons." But Raya was already reaching for her phone, giddy with excitement. This was the kind of discovery that made careers, that got marine biologists featured in National Geographic. This was her chance to finally make the impact she'd dreamed of since graduate school. She called the Outer Banks Historical Society first, speaking with Dr. Patricia Holloway, the chief maritime archaeologist. Dr. Holloway's excitement was infectious. She promised to drive down from Norfolk immediately with a proper documentation team. "This is incredible, Ms. Morgan," Dr. Holloway had said. "La Hermosa Estrella has been a holy grail for maritime archaeologists for decades. You've made one of the most significant discoveries in North Carolina waters." The team arrived that evening: Dr. Holloway, 2 graduate students, and a man in a suit who introduced himself as James Crawford from the State Department of Cultural Resources. They photographed everything, took GPS readings, and carefully packaged each artifact in museum-quality containers. "For safekeeping," Dr. Holloway explained as they loaded the lead box into a van. "We'll need to run authentication tests, document the provenance, get everything properly catalogued. You'll have full credit as the discoverer, of course." Raya signed papers that she barely read, too excited to focus on the fine print. She was going to be famous. She was going to change maritime history. 3 days later, the excitement had curdled into anxiety. Dr. Holloway wasn't returning her calls. The Historical Society's receptionist claimed no record of any recent Spanish colonial discoveries. When Raya drove to their Norfolk offices, security told her Dr. Holloway was unavailable indefinitely. The call from Ben came Tuesday morning, his voice tight with anger. "They've sealed off the dive site. Federal markers, Coast Guard patrol boats, the whole 9 yards. Official notice says it's a protected archaeological zone, unauthorized diving prohibited." "But that's good," Raya said, though her stomach was already sinking. "It means they're taking the discovery seriously." "Raya," Ben's voice was gentle but firm, "there's no mention of you anywhere on the federal notices. No mention of La Hermosa Estrella. The site's been classified as Wreck Site UNC 447, colonial period vessel of unknown origin." The phone slipped from her numb fingers. She drove to the beach house in a panic, Marcus Reed's journal clutched in her hands, the only proof she had left that any of this had happened. But as she pulled into the sandy driveway, her heart sank further. The front door was ajar, hanging from one hinge. Every room had been methodically searched. Furniture overturned, books scattered, diving equipment pulled from shelves and examined. In the basement, the pit where she'd found the chest had been thoroughly excavated, every floorboard pried up and discarded. They'd taken everything. Every artifact, every piece of documentation, every trace of Marcus Reed's 40-year project. Raya sank onto the violated couch, fighting back tears. She'd been naive, trusting, everything Uncle Lawrence and Marcus had apparently learned not to be. The discovery of a lifetime had been stolen from her by the very people she thought would celebrate it. But as she looked up at the diving helmet above the fireplace, Marcus Reed's helmet that had somehow escaped the searcher's attention, something caught her eye. The helmet had been moved. Just slightly, but enough that the chains weren't hanging quite right. Heart pounding, Raya climbed onto a chair and carefully lifted the helmet from its mount. Taped to the back, hidden from view, was a waterproof pouch. Inside, she found photocopies of every page from Marcus's journal, photographs of every artifact in the chest, and a legal document that made her hands shake, a certificate of salvage rights, properly filed and notarized, naming Lawrence Beaumont and Marcus Reed as co-discoverers of La Hermosa Estrella, dated 15 years ago. Lawrence had been ready for this betrayal all along. Tucked into the final page was a handwritten note in her great-uncle's careful script. Raya, they tried this before. The truth has a way of surfacing. Call Tommy Bradshaw at the Virginian Pilot. He owes me a favor. L. For the first time in days, Raya smiled. Tommy Bradshaw turned out to be a gruff investigative reporter in his 50s who answered his phone with a string of creative profanities that made Raya grateful her mother couldn't hear. But when she mentioned Lawrence Beaumont's name, his tone shifted completely. Larry's niece? Jesus, I heard about his passing. That man saved my career more times than I can count. Tommy's voice softened with genuine affection. What kind of trouble are you in, kid? Raya told him everything. The inheritance, the journal, the discovery, and the theft. Tommy listened without interruption, occasionally making sounds that suggested he was taking notes. When she finished, there was a long pause. You got pictures of the artifacts? Documentation? Everything. Uncle Lawrence hid copies of everything. Smart man. Always said the feds would try to screw over anyone who found something worth finding. Tommy's keyboard clicked in the background. Email me everything you've got. And I mean everything. Photos, documents, GPS coordinates, the works. This stinks to high heaven, and I know exactly who to call. The story broke 72 hours later. Treasure hunters or treasure thieves? Ran across the front page of the Virginian Pilot, accompanied by photographs of the Spanish coins and a detailed account of how federal officials had appropriated Raya's discovery without proper documentation or credit. Tommy had done his homework, tracking down the mysterious Dr. Holloway and James Crawford, revealing a pattern of similar thefts stretching back years. But Tommy hadn't stopped there. He'd also researched Marcus Reed, finally finding records that Lawrence had helped seal decades earlier. Marcus had been a legitimate marine archaeologist who'd grown disgusted with institutional corruption and had decided to preserve important discoveries outside official channels until they could be properly protected. The national media picked up the story within hours. CNN, NPR, and the Washington Post all ran features on the case of the stolen Spanish treasure. Social media exploded with outrage over federal overreach and academic corruption. #JusticeForRaya began trending on Twitter. The pressure worked faster than Raya had dared hope. Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History called personally to apologize and invite Raya to Washington. The state of North Carolina announced a full investigation into the Department of Cultural Resources. Most importantly, they officially recognized Raya Morgan and the estates of Lawrence Beaumont and Marcus Reed as co-discoverers of La Hermosa Estrella. But the real vindication came 6 months later, standing in the renovated beach house that now bore a brass plaque reading, "The Lawrence Beaumont Maritime Heritage Center." The transformation had been remarkable. The Coast Guard had lifted the diving restrictions, and marine archaeologists from 3 universities were working together to properly excavate and document the shipwreck. The Spanish had contributed funding for the research, recognizing the historical importance of the find. Most crucially, all artifacts would remain in North Carolina, displayed in the Heritage Center for Public Education. Raya had been named as the center's first director, with a salary that finally made her student loans manageable. She'd also been accepted into the doctoral program at Duke University, with her dissertation focusing on the historical significance of La Hermosa Estrella and the preservation of maritime heritage sites. The main floor of the beach house now showcased the recovered artifacts in climate-controlled cases, surrounded by interactive displays that told the story of Spanish colonial shipping and the treacherous waters of the Outer Banks. But Marcus Reed's diving helmet still hung in its place of honor above the restored fireplace, watching over everything with those dark glass eyes. On this particular evening, as autumn light streamed through the new windows, Raya found herself alone in the center after the last visitors had departed. She stood before the helmet, thinking about the intricate plan that Lawrence and Marcus had woven across decades. She understood now that her inheritance had never been about the house or the treasure. It had been about finding someone who would fight for the truth, someone who wouldn't let important discoveries disappear into bureaucratic black holes or private collections. Lawrence had chosen her not just because she was family, but because she was a marine biologist, someone who would understand the scientific importance of what they'd preserved. The journal entries made sense now, too. Every Project Sandglass reference had been about time, about waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right opportunity to ensure their discoveries served history rather than special interests. "You planned this whole thing, didn't you?" she whispered to the empty room. "The will, the hidden documents, even Tommy Bradshaw. You knew exactly what would happen when I reported the discovery." As if in response, the evening light shifted, casting the helmet's shadow across a framed photograph on the mantel, a picture Tommy had uncovered showing Lawrence and Marcus standing beside their boat, both men grinning broadly, the kind of smile that came from shared adventures and deep friendship. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Ben Cartwright appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee from the center's small cafe. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her a cup. "Long day?" "Good day," Raya corrected, accepting the coffee gratefully. "We had 3 school groups, a delegation from the Spanish Maritime Museum, and a documentary crew. I think Uncle Lawrence would be proud." Ben nodded, looking around the transformed space. "Marcus too. He always said the ocean gives up its secrets when it's ready, to the people who'll treat them with respect." As they stood together in the peaceful center, surrounded by centuries of maritime history, Raya finally understood the true weight of her inheritance. She wasn't just preserving artifacts, she was carrying forward a legacy of discovery, protection, and respect for the stories that lay hidden beneath the waves. Outside, the Atlantic crashed against the shore with its eternal rhythm, keeping its remaining secrets safe until the right person came along to share them with the world.